Venezuela is gripped by crisis. Ravaged by economic collapse and marred by political decay, the government of Nicolas Maduro faces an existential threat.
Maduro has been ruling in the middle of a very big storm.
Latin America's once model democracy struggles to maintain order and feed a divided people.
We have never seen a deterioration of living standards of this magnitude almost anywhere in the world.
A nation boasting the world's largest oil reserves fights for economic survival as it's pulled further apart.
Polarization is there racially, is there regionally, is there by class. It's there in multiple ways.
But the seeds of its current demise were sown a century ago, when the events of its formative years ensured that the fate of Venezuela would be written in oil.
This country that was once the wealthiest in the region, what went wrong? How did we get to this point in Venezuela?
The country starts a modernization process that is shaped by oil. This petrostate becomes more and more powerful, and they shape that country through the state.
Chavez and then Maduro's regime tried to create a socialist revolution. And that led these people to destroy the whole business apparatus of the country.
That unemployment did go down, equality increased, per capita GDP increased. Of course, you could say that's because of the oil wealth. At the same time, that oil wealth could have been distributed completely differently, and I would say was distributed much more equitably.
Venezuela was a very backward country before oil, one of the poorest of Latin America.
Life expectancy was in your early 30s, and about 3/4 of the country was illiterate.
It's very difficult to speak of a national polity, much less of a national culture.
Then we have an extraordinary development in 1914 when Venezuela sinks its first wells and begins pumping oil for the first time.
Venezuela enters the era of commercial heavy oil production, and not only are the British and the Dutch involved, but now the US also comes to Venezuela to partake in oil's production.
Foreign oil giants such as Royal Dutch Shell and the American Standard Oil Company were granted concessions by the military dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gomez, allowing them to drill for oil and allowing Gomez to get rich.
The arrival of the oil companies, the development of the industry, parallels the rise of Juan Vicente Gomez and the rise of the Venezuelan state.
Even though Venezuela really begins to develop its oil economy, the Venezuelan state doesn't benefit hugely because, in essence, it's only charging rent for the land.
By the mid-1930s, the once loose collective of largely coffee-exporting regions had become a consolidated nation-state, formed and transformed by oil.
We have the beginnings of a mass process of urbanization. So people are coming out of the rural countrysides into the big cities because the major landowners are selling off their land to the oil companies.
The very idea of oil became imbued with the notion of modernity. That the oil camps, with the North American presence, the British presence, with electricity, water, sewage, would then become social laboratories that other Venezuelans should emulate.
On the one hand, there were people who were living in the oil camps, who received all the benefits of working for oil companies. And then on the outside of these camps, you had the majority of Venezuelan society who didn't have access to all of the healthcare and benefits and education benefits.
Juan Vicente Gomez died in 1935, but he'd laid the blueprint for other dictators to follow, developing infrastructure suppressing dissent, and getting rich off oil deals. The first half of the 20th century would see Venezuela ruled by oppressive military regimes for all but 3 years, when a popular push for democracy in 1945 briefly unseated dictatorship. But the political parties cemented in that democratic interlude, Acción Democrática, AD, and COPE, Christian Democrats, remained a persistent opposition to authoritarian rule. By the mid-1950s, the rule of another dictator, General Marcos Pérez Jiménez, would create a vastly expanded and increasingly unequal state.
We enter what some have called the bulldozer years in Venezuela. The state will now use the funds, the profits of oil to engage in broad-scale developmentalist projects. Those are all great opportunities for development, but also for corruption. Because in process of developing those projects, the military and their associates were all benefiting tremendously.
The big problem is that the only way Pérez Jiménez can maintain himself in power is through brutal repression. What we see is a real clampdown, brutal clampdown on political opposition.
You start to seeing also the very clear parameters of two Venezuelas. The Venezuela that benefits from oil and the Venezuela that actually still remains in the shadow of the oil industry. And that Venezuela is rural, that Venezuela is poor, that Venezuela is illiterate, that Venezuela is seeing and looking at the evolution of the other, but is not benefiting from it.
As Venezuela's elite got richer and its poor were getting left behind, the forces for democracy, once again, dared to take on a dictator.
You begin to see rumblings in the military. You begin to see younger officers protesting much the same way they had protested before. There's also an active social movement being led by dissidents in the Communist Party, in Acción Democrática, even the Social Democrats and others that are actually cooperating to undermine Pérez Jiménez.
So Pérez Jiménez is effectively overthrown through another coup, which then brings us democracy in Venezuela in 1958.
Democracy had fallen to dictatorship a decade earlier. For it now to survive, unity was a must.
There is an attempt to form a pact. So AD comes to the table with its union and party political framework. COPE comes to the table, the Christian Democrat right. So what you have around the table is essentially all of the key financial and political interests in the country. The Roman Catholic Church is also essentially party to these negotiations, as is the military.
These parties signed the Pacto de Punto Fijo and began what has been called in Venezuela the Punto Fijismo, meaning there was an agreement in which the parties agreed not to go in conflicts that could put at risk Venezuelan democracy.
Venezuela was moving inexorably toward the so-called First World with growing confidence. It had broken the cycle of military coups, and now the Punto Fijo Pact ensured progress would be underwritten by democratic process.
Venezuela enters a kind of golden age because it has its modernization going on now for 2 decades, and it also has now a democracy that begins to be an example for the rest of Latin America.
In 1960, Venezuela helped establish the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. And in 1973, following the hike in oil prices after war in the Middle East, it was awash with petrodollars. Venezuela was asserting itself as a global player. And in Carlos Andrés Pérez, it would have a president ready to take the next big step and take back its oil.
That was the dream of democracy. And so Carlos Andrés says, I've got the money, why not? Let's do it. And so we nationalized the oil industry in 1975. It is called PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, S.A.
What it essentially does is it nationalizes the bureaucracy of oil exploration. It's nationalization to create a company rather than nationalization of Venezuela's oil sector per se.
Many of the oil workers maintain their privileged status in the oil camps. And this is the period in Venezuela that many refer to as La Venezuela Saudita, an image of Saudi Venezuela, in which the notion is, and one of the terms in Venezuela is, "Ta barato, dame dos." It's cheap, give me two. And Venezuela had that kind of wealth.
The dream of a state-owned oil company had been realized with PDVSA. President Carlos Andrés Pérez now embarked on a nationwide spending spree, funding social programs, housing projects, and nationalizing industries. With the price of crude oil at a record high, such lavish spending could also be supplemented by borrowing.
He wanted Venezuela to be an industrialized country, and he thought this could be done because we had a lot of money. So this idea also puts us in loans and more money that continues as long as the price of oil is good.
As the oil price begins to fall back, Venezuela doesn't reduce its financial outlays. You have this huge bureaucracy which also emerges in Venezuela, and huge amounts of corruption.
Government high posts implicitly had the benefit of helping yourself and helping others in your social circle.
But instead of addressing any of these problems, the strategy of the government is instead to borrow money.
The debt becomes more difficult to pay. Under that environment, Acción Democrática loses the election of 1979, and we have to go more to a market economy.
Inflation begins to take off, corruption becomes an even more profound problem, and yet we have no effort made by any of the governments in the 1980s to actually address the overwhelming reliance on oil, which was falling in value.
Successive governments of Acción Democrática and COPEI did little to check the economic decline, social inequality, and the corruption of a ruling class. In December 1988, Carlos Andrés Pérez was re-elected to office, promising to bring back the cash-rich glory years of his first term. But rhetoric would be trumped by reality.
Once he is sworn into power, he tells the Venezuelan people, I already have negotiated and I'm going to the IMF.
Venezuela had to go to an agreement with the International Monetary Fund to...
You're saying there was no choice?
No choice at that time, because Venezuela was indebted. Venezuela had to go to some adjustments, structural adjustment, to launch the growth again.
The problem is, Greg, this IMF loan comes with some very difficult terms and conditions. You have a segment of the population that hasn't benefited from the boom times. Living conditions have been deteriorating through the 80s, and now comes this IMF loan where, yet again, they're feeling the effects. Should Pérez have anticipated this?
Well, yes, he should have, certainly, because it affected, again, the poor who had been already suffering. It affects them even more. But I would say just one step back also in terms of, was there an alternative? I think we have to keep in mind, on the one hand, that at that time, the neoliberal kind of policy paradigm was absolutely hegemonic around the world. And so it certainly appeared that way, I think, that there was no alternative. I would argue from today's perspective, there probably were some alternatives. One of them would have been perhaps to actually default on the debt, which of course, has all kinds of other consequences. One can talk about trying to, for example, tax the wealthy more, or some other way of raising revenues other than cutting back on the parts that have an impact on the poor.
What do you say to that, Carlos? People were still suffering in terms of unemployment and wages.
Yeah, because when you change, when you have to, the idea in the second Carlos Andrés Pérez government was that the country couldn't be resorting on oil resources, couldn't be depending on the state resources. They had to promote private entrepreneurship. They have to promote the participation of a business. We had to promote foreign and national investment in oil, in other industries that were state-owned. How could change always implies pain? And to lessen the pain for the majority, there were some of the most advanced social programs at that time that later on were, taken by Brazil and by Mexico too.
Margarita, who is feeling the...
I have a different perspective on that. I mean, you want to change us from one day to the other into a free market economy when we have been a state economy throughout all the 20th century? I mean, you can't do that. And I think the problem was not that the change had to come, and we still haven't been able to have a market economy in some way that will let us to feed the population, the 30 million of Venezuelans that we are. But the problem was the way it was put out. It was a political problem. The political problem was Carlos Andrés said, you know what, we can't take this anymore. We're changing, and we're going to do a radical change.
What also played a major role in that moment was the fact that Carlos Andrés Pérez ran on a platform that was anti-neoliberal when he ran for president, and then made this big turnaround. I mean, that's why it was a 180-degree turn.
A week after he came into office?
Actually, that, I think, has a major impact on what happened afterwards as well.
Actually, I think that's not accurate, because he said in his electoral campaign that he was going to bring major changes in Venezuela and the economy and political realm. But what is true is that he represented
the golden years.
The golden years that we had in the 1970s.
Is that your understanding, Greg?
He was perceived in one way and then does the opposite. And that was exactly what was this adding insult to injury. I mean, the injury being the cutbacks on subsidies for transportation or for food. And at the same time, this is not what we thought we were voting for.
Yeah, I think there was a big disenchantment. He doesn't consult his party because he thinks he is so popular, he doesn't need to consult his party to do this radical change. And so there is some arrogance in Carlos Andrés vis-a-vis his party. He says, if I go to my party, I lose too much time. He goes to the IMF to do a shock therapy. That's the way it was called at that time. With a country that depended on the state for everything. You can't just jump into a free market economy without giving a transition to the people, without convincing the people, without doing some kind of political maneuver there to convince the people that that is necessary. The people didn't think it was necessary. That's the point. I really think that the society was used to something, and as Carlos said, if you change that, it's going to be painful, and the society is going to resist, and that's the Caracazo.
By 1989, the country was facing a very dire situation. The government of Carlos Andrés Pérez, of which I was part, tried to rebalance the economy by eliminating all of these price controls, exchange controls, refinancing the debt, and asking for international financial assistance. But before any of these policies were adopted, the government that had taken over on February 2nd, 1989, was met with this Caracazo.
This was a massive revolt of the Venezuelan people.
Popular sectors, poor sectors who were coming down from the barrios.
It started out of the raise of petrol in the gas stations.
Poor people, middle-class people were ransacking markets.
It spirals into this massive social explosion because in many ways that Venezuelan dream had come to an end. The Pacto de Punto Fijo was shattered because in response to the massive social protests, spontaneous social protests, the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez, his ministers, his supporters, supported the use of the military.
The deepening economic turmoil and simmering distrust of the political elite now saw Caracas ablaze with riots and looting. President Perez gave orders for the military to restore order to the streets of Caracas. The military's response would be deadly.
These were troops that had, some of them were youngsters that are 18 years old. They were afraid of the people of the city. They put them into shanty towns, and they started killing.
It was a very brutal, it was a very horrific repression of popular mobilization.
This was the moment of rupture with democracy in Venezuela.
The headline in Newsweek in the US was, Latin America's model democracy explodes.
Government figures claim 276 civilians were killed in the military crackdown. Independent reports suggested the death toll was almost twice as high. A red line had been crossed, and a new figure was about to emerge that would challenge a failing government and change the course of Venezuelan history.
The military started conspiring against the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez. And this conspiracy is going to take place, is going to come out in the open in 1992 with the coup of February the 4th. The leader of the coup was Hugo Chavez.
The coup attempt was launched in 6 different cities across Venezuela. Because Chavez had failed to capture Caracas, he was basically taken prisoner, and during a very, very famous television interview when the coup was over,
Lamentablemente, por ahora, los objetivos que nos planteamos no fueron logrados en la ciudad capital.
Chavez said, "We failed to achieve our goals for now, por ahora." And this 2-word sentence really became the catchphrase of demands for political change in Venezuela.
The government of Perez doing these reforms had a lot of discontent. When Chavez attempted a coup in February 1992, suddenly that discontent got the face that represented the disturbances that the society had.
Chavez is now on the political map, and he, in effect, is seen as the political savior for those completely disaffected with AD and COP.
Hugo Chavez, a middle-ranking officer in the Venezuelan army, had failed to overthrow Carlos Andrés Pérez and was sent to prison. He would be released within 2 years. He'd taken on a corrupt elite, stood up for the poor, and transformed himself from a man of the military to a man of the people. By 1998, the man who would be king would be elected as president.
En Venezuela tiene su hora, y es que llegó la hora del pueblo.
In December 1998, Hugo Chavez, a former army lieutenant colonel, was elected as president of Venezuela.
Señor Comandante Hugo Chávez Frías.
In a country divided by race and class, where white equaled wealth and privilege, and anything else meant everything less, Chávez's victory was an historic turning point.
He was of a mixed indigenous heritage. He was really nothing like anything that we had ever seen before in terms of Venezuelan presidential elections or politics, which had always been very much dominated by a white elite class of politician.
Chavez was elected on a very simple platform saying that essentially the problem is corruption and we have to get rid of this political class.
Chavez was talking about the importance of a third way between socialism and capitalism. It was all about participatory democracy, and what Chavez was promising to do was to completely overhaul the Punto Fijo state.
The new president created a constituent assembly to write a new constitution and set about his task of transforming the country.
Chavez began to say, we need to eradicate this poverty in our country, and the way to do it is by gaining control of our oil industry and making sure those profits are going back into our country.
Reconocemos la importancia que tiene PDVSA para el país, pero al mismo tiempo siempre hemos dicho desde antes de llegar al gobierno que PDVSA no puede ser un Estado dentro del Estado.
By seeking greater control of the national oil company, PDVSA, Chavez was taking on Venezuela's most prized and powerful asset. The fight for PDVSA spilled out onto the streets, becoming symbolic of the struggle between two Venezuelas. One left behind by an oil-fueled modernity, the other looking to keep its place and its control within it. Caracas was a tinderbox of competing ideals, battling for the very idea of Venezuela.
Venezuela was in huge turmoil. Everyday demonstrations in the streets. Going to Miraflores, the presidential palace.
There was an opposition rally that was moving in hundreds of thousands towards the palace in order to ask Chavez to resign. But the palace was surrounded by backers of Hugo Chavez that were going to resist this rally. People that were on buildings shooting. We don't know who they were. Several civilians fell dead of both sides.
Chavez called the army to send the tanks into the street to stop the people. And the army said, sorry, this is a political problem. We are not sending the tanks to the street to stop the people.
That was the coup. That was really when the moment the coup happened was when his minister said, I can't go out.
The army had been scarred by their handling of the Caracazo unrest in 1989. But its high rank had been conspiring with elements of the elite establishment deposed by Chavez, and together they plotted his downfall.
We started getting reports in the fall of 2001 that, this guy, that guy, the other guy are planning a coup.
Charles Shapiro had taken his seat as the U.S. ambassador to Venezuela just 3 weeks before the coup against President Chavez, a coup that was far from secret.
It becomes like background noise. If we're hearing this, everybody in Venezuela is hearing it as well.
The executives of PDVSA were in the queue. The church was in the coup. The Cardinal of Caracas was in the coup. The entrepreneurs, the president of Fede Cámaras was in the coup.
And so it became clear that they were planning something, and the U.S. ambassador who was in Venezuela at the time was openly collaborating with the opposition.
The U.S. government did not organize, plan, implement, authorize a coup, okay? And if I had, I'm not organized enough to have organized a coup in 3 weeks.
Chavez was forced out by this coalition of, these opposition groups allied with these dissenting high-ranking military officers who had forcefully gone in and taken him against his will.
Chavez had been ousted, taken into custody, and flown to an offshore military base. Pedro Carmona, the head of the Venezuelan Chamber of Commerce, Fede Cámaras, was now hastily sworn in as interim president. His presidency would last only hours.
When this huge pro-Chavez demonstration comes and essentially drives Carmona and his government out of the presidential palace, The military sends a helicopter to pick up Chavez. Chavez gets back to the presidential palace.
It's something like a movie, a Hollywood movie. He comes back in a helicopter in the night, and the people are waiting for him. And he says, oh, here I am, go to sleep, I'm here, I'm president again.
Within 48 hours of being overthrown, Hugo Chavez was back in power. 8 months later, his authority would be challenged once again.
Certain officers of the oil company seem to have been involved in the coup. But in any case, Chavez didn't feel strong enough to oust them from the company. And what they did was that they continued to conspire to make a better coup. That's really what they did. And so, what was a better coup? An oil lockout.
This is not a strike. This was the result of an action taken by executives and by high oil executive officials to actually lock out employees, to bring production to zero, to try to crash the economy in Venezuela, to put the economy on its knees.
The National Oil Company, along with the Union Federation and the Chamber of Commerce, conspired to bring Venezuela to an economic standstill with the aim of bringing down Hugo Chavez.
The strike proved to be a failure. They were unable to stop production. There's a new sense of PDVSA that comes out of the strike, that PDVSA now belongs to a larger number of Venezuelans than rather the symbol of a privileged status for a small select number of individuals.
Hugo Chavez had held firm, and now, at the beginning of 2003, the president's resilience turned to resurgence.
Este pueblo está listo para salir de nuevo el día que sea necesario a defender su democracia y a defender su revolución.
So he went to Cuba, and Cuba came up with a bunch of new social programs. And he started to implement these new social programs, massive new social programs for healthcare, for access to food, and for scholarships.
We have a whole raft of these so-called misiones, the social programs, which give people citizenship rights, identity cards, access to job training, access to breakfast clubs, university systems. So this is a very comprehensive effort to deliver basic social services.
What this is doing, though, is essentially still using oil as that redemptive quality to bring social change, while bringing social change, deepening the dependence on oil, and he can do this while the prices of oil are high.
He had access to finance. He could borrow as if it was going out of fashion. So he decided that that was the moment to radicalize the process.
In 2007, with the price of crude oil 6 times greater than when he was first elected to office, Chavez embarked on a nationalization drive.
Esta es la verdadera nacionalización del petróleo. El petróleo es de todos los venezolanos.
He renegotiated oil contracts and brought power and resource companies, as well as telecommunications groups and banks, under state ownership, and in his view, under the will of the Venezuelan people.
He's trying to continue on with this grassroots governance, but the more entrenched he became in power, the more the further away he drifted from that initial model that had been so widely accepted and, beloved by the people. Oil prices began to decrease. People began to say, wait a minute, before it's all gone, I'm going to get my piece of it.
When Chavez had first come to power, he had said that essentially there was going to be a hard hand, an iron fist against these problems of corruption, which had been so overt under Pontifijismo. But the reality was that absolutely nothing was done.
As the integrity of his government withered, so too did the president's health. Chavez was suffering with cancer and could no longer keep his ailing condition hidden from the Venezuelan people. In October 2012, Still frail from intensive treatment, Hugo Chavez won a fourth term as president. By March 2013, he was dead.
It's impossible to underestimate the effect that the death of Chavez had. The outpouring that one saw on the streets at the same time as the celebration of some people really was explicative of the kind of Venezuelas we had, with thousands lined up to see his body laying in state, others in Miami and others in Caracas celebrating.
You die and the charisma dies with you. He was ruling through his charisma and through his money. And those two things disappeared in 2013.
They didn't set any money aside in a sovereign wealth fund and a rainy day fund, so they've got money in case things go down. Everybody in the oil industry knows oil prices are cyclical.
They used the period of the oil boom from 2004 to 2014 to sextuple the public debt.
The biggest sucker in Venezuelan history is the guy who's going to follow Chavez as president. And that's exactly what happened.
Nicolas Maduro, a former bus driver and trade unionist who'd served as foreign minister, was handpicked by Chavez as his successor.
Chávez, te lo juro, hemos cumplido el juramento. Independencia y patria socialista.
Maduro was no Chavez. His narrow election victory in April 2013 and the deepening economic crisis would herald protests from a restive population and a renewed challenge from an emboldened opposition.
When the oil price started dropping, the government had a severe debt and did not have enough dollars to buy the food imports and the medicine imports. A whole wave of protests arose in this context.
What we have during the first couple of years of the Maduro presidency is the opposition use of protest and street mobilization as a way of discrediting and delegitimizing the government becomes the key opposition tool.
The protests are sidetracked by these more violent sectors who are looking for an incident.
Protests against crime, against food shortages, and against economic hardship were all ultimately protests against the Maduro government. Violence was met with violence. Clashes between protesters and state forces would leave dozens of Venezuelans dead.
Maduro has no support. The only support that Maduro has is the repressive forces of the state, the military, the police, and the paramilitary groups.
In parliamentary elections held in December 2015, the opposition Democratic Unity Roundtable, that had included parties such as Acción Democrática and COPE, secured a two-thirds majority in the National Assembly. Convulsed by the prospect of the opposition blocking government appointments, as well as dictating policy, President Maduro manipulated Supreme Court appointments and manufactured a ruling favorable to his objective, to nullify the National Assembly.
That's where some of us began to see these transgressions into, a more authoritarian type of government, less democratic. Then clearly we've stepped beyond the bounds of democracy and far beyond the participatory democracy that the Bolivarian Revolution had proposed to build in the country.
In May 2017, amidst continuing protests against his government, Maduro announced plans to hold elections for a new legislative body. The Constituent Assembly would have sweeping powers to rewrite the Constitution and dissolve the opposition-led National Assembly. Such plans would lead to 3 months of sustained clashes between anti-government protesters and the government's own forces.
This mass protest was met with massive, massive repression. In the end, 135 people were killed, 15 of them on July 30th, 2017, the day when the National Constituent Assembly was elected. 15,000 people were injured, 6,000 people were put in prison. It was a repression of a scale that the country had never seen.
2017 would continue to be a year of contested elections. The Constituent Assembly would be boycotted by the opposition, leaving Maduro loyalists with total control. The ruling Socialist Party would also win 18 of the 23 governorships in the gubernatorial elections in October. Contested counts and procedural irregularities dogged the elections that were claimed as proof of Chavismo's enduring appeal by Maduro and gave cause for the opposition to call for more protests and more unrest. In 2018, the year of another pivotal presidential election that will divide a fractured nation once more, the battle for Venezuela goes on.
People need to be expressed politically, all the dissatisfaction and the rejection that they are feeling and the desire that they have for a political change, and I would say they want the democracy back. And the opposition hasn't known how to put their act together to give that strategy and that political expression, because that is not going to come from the government. They are authoritarian and totalitarian.
Is there any way, any chance that you can have the opposition and the government have any type of talks and negotiations? What is clear throughout discussion is that through the decades, you have had a class struggle, you had a power struggle playing out. This is a deeply divided society. Can these forces that have been opponents for so long ever coexist?
Well, currently they are negotiating, and I think there's a willingness on both sides to come to an agreement because the economic crisis has been going on for so long, and people will tend to blame Maduro for that. Although I think the U.S. and the opposition bear a large part of the blame for the current economic crisis. Venezuela is in a kind of semi-civil war situation right now with the opposition from the U.S. The U.S. is putting tremendous pressure with its financial sanctions against Venezuela, where it cannot refinance its debt. That is having an economic impact, as well as, of course, the ongoing the tremendously high inflation, which I think is partly also the government's fault. But the combination of these factors is going to cause a lot of people to say, we give up, we're going to vote for somebody else.
I think the only solution for Venezuela are negotiations for a transition to democracy, meaning resignation of Maduro, free and fair elections supervised by international organizations, and to get a new path to democracy.
Great.
Personally, I think that the elections are already very guaranteed in terms of their security and protected against fraud, but they could have additional controls, and that could happen. Then that might be a way of moving forward, but it all depends, again, on who the opposition candidate is and if they can actually challenge the Bolivarian, so to speak, movement, which is still very substantial in Venezuela.
Is there any hope for coexistence between those that support the Bolivarian revolution and those that oppose it, or is it always going to be like this in Venezuela, a zero-sum game for survival?
I think that the people that are at the top of the government don't have any disposition for changing their points of view. And so there's no way we can go to a democratic transition.
But I think one could say the same thing about the stubbornness of the opposition. I mean, they've taken also very extreme, very hardline positions that make negotiation extremely difficult. So
like
I think.
What? Like for fair elections?
No,
asking
for Maduro's resignation.
And that is
a position
that's not on the table right there. Right?
Well, that's what they've been asking for.
No,
and that's what I'm saying.
That's not on the table. I'm sorry.
But that's
on the table are 4 things: to free the prisoners, to recognize the National Assembly, to give a chronogram of a fair election. What's the fourth? And
And to respect the national laws.
And to call for humanitarian.
Right, on that
They're
basis,
not asking
I
for the
think
resignation.
an agreement is possible, but so far the demonstrations and all of the demands in the public sphere have been a resignation of Maduro.
Demonstrations are democratic rights. People have
I'm
the
not
right
saying that they can't demonstrate for it, but I'm saying as long as they maintain that position, an agreement will not happen.
If you ask for a resignation of a officer or public officer, that's your right.
Of course, I'm not saying it's not their right. I'm just saying that no agreement will be reached on that basis.
Yeah, but that is not on the table of negotiation. I repeat, there are 4 things that are on the table of negotiation. The resignment of Maduro is not on the table.
Well, that's why I said that an agreement is possible in that sense, but not on the demand for a resignation.
What did Rodriguez just say? Jorge Rodriguez said, you recognize the National Constituent Assembly. The opposition cannot recognize the National Constituent Assembly because it completely destroys democracy.
The main issue is that the government has the National Constituent Assembly with a supra-constitutional power that can decide whatever it wants to decide, to suppress governors, to suppress mayors, to
approve
change
budgets out of the National Assembly, whatever it wants.
You don't have any control, social control, on that body that is the body of the dictatorship, the tool, the fist of the dictatorship.
I mean, there's many different responses to that, but I mean, one of them is, of course, that this was an elected body, even though that the government, I mean, the opposition boycotted that election.
But it wasn't a democratic election. You have to agree
but
with
you
that.
know, dictators do democratic elections.
But the opposition could have won it. Actually,
how can you tell me that it's democratic? The base of democracy is one citizen, one vote.
We are talking about 2 Venezuelas. The upper middle class, in many ways, thought that they owned the Venezuelan national project. It was their project. It was their notion of a country, because in many ways, it was part of their property, their privilege, their position. And that other Venezuela was always an uncomfortable attachment. That other Venezuela was always there, but not part of the national narrative. That Venezuela that was historically erased out of the dominant narrative in the oil years, that Venezuela that exists in the ranchos that surround Caracas and almost every other major city in Venezuela, that Venezuela which includes a very diverse segment of the population and who saw their lives improved under Chavez.
It goes well beyond what Hugo Chavez's vision was for Venezuela. What a lot of this has showed is that the movement wasn't strong enough to survive on its own without its leader.
This is a regime that rules according to the right they have to rule because they are the successors of Chavez, that inherit his legacy.
How is it possible that a participatory democracy that's supposed to be grassroots-based and a government of the people can't survive with just the people, but was really led by a leader? Because no one could fill the shoes of Hugo Chavez.
We're dealing with a very fragmented society. It comes from 2 different lived experiences. There is no going back to pre-1998 and pre-Chavez. Venezuela has been transformed. It has changed. What it will evolve to remains to be seen.